not the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Well, hello to anyone or everyone that is watching today. My name is Sam Lopez, and with my wife, Courtney, we have the honor of being the lead pastors of Hillsong California. And today I am joined with my friend and my brother, Sam Collier, and him with his wife are the lead pastors of Hillsong Atlanta. And so today we in honoring this weekend Martin Luther King Jr., we wanted to just have a conversation about his life, have a conversation about what his life means to us, the implications of that today as pastors as well, and what we can hope for in the future. And so Sam, obviously it's good to have you.
Sam and Sam.
Sam and Sam.
Man, I'm so honored to be here. I was a little bit upset about the wardrobe change that you had.
I mean, I had to.
Because you
It got cold.
awesome.
It got cold. I was wearing a short sleeve shirt. I had to change.
Right, man. You know, what a time it is in our world.
It is.
And with it being MLK Day, I believe when this is coming out, I think so many of us are reflecting on what he meant. And I often get this question, I wonder what MLK would say today. And those are some of the questions that I'm kind of thinking through, and I'm sure we'll dive into today. But man,
Yeah.
it was just time for the East Coast and the West Coast to come together.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to have this conversation and to look at, I think even importantly, the present and look at the future. But I think there's so much that we can learn about what's coming by looking at the past. There's so much to learn from the past as we look to the future. And I think that it's one of the biblical things that we see, right? When the people of God crossed the Jordan River, God asked them to collect stones to remember what he had done in that moment. And I believe that Dr. King's life is one of those memory stones, is a stone that has been laid down, in which I believe in the kingdom of God, we can look at his life, look from his example, and obviously on top of that, and most importantly, the life of Jesus, to look towards the future, look at our present, at how we can navigate these seasons. Because I do think that one of the things people forget is that Dr. King was he was a pastor.
He was a pastor.
He was a pastor.
Man, people forget that, and it's interesting because, and this is just my personal opinion, I think that the world wants to take the Christianity out of social justice. And I think it makes us more comfortable because Christianity requires for us to do so many things that are countercultural.
Right.
One, to nationalism, two, to anger. I mean, we have these things that we believe in, and legitimate hurt, legitimate pain, but we serve a God that talks to us about doing the opposite, even of what we want to do.
Right.
And so I think it's a lot easier for our world to go, well, he wasn't, let's just not remember the preacher. Let's just think about the social activists and all the other things. But you can't think about Dr. King without thinking about Jesus. He would often say that he got his philosophy from Jesus and his methodology from Gandhi. And so when you talk about the idea of nonviolence, Gandhi kind of had that nonviolent resistance and those other things, the protest and all of that, but doing it in a peaceful way with the desire to have a peaceful result in the end. But the philosophy coming and rooted in Christ. And you know, it's interesting that we want to take the Christianity out of kind of who Dr. King was. And it's one of the things I think that's missing so much from how we are approaching how to bring our world together today.
Right.
Kind of the Jesus, factor. So.
Well, I mean, obviously you being in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And, not far from Montgomery and places that were so significant in civil rights era. How has that had an impact on your life? Has that shaped even kind of, as we're talking about looking to the past, what is that something that you can take on board now that's influenced you, that has shaped you?
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing any of that?
Oh man, I mean, there's so much. I grew up across the street from the King Center.
Oh, wow.
On Auburn Avenue.
I didn't know that.
I know my dad had a barber shop on Auburn. It's like it was the oldest kind of barber shop on that in business on Auburn for a long time.
You got to stop right there. Honestly, we just got to give a shout out to all the barbers in the world. I love my barber.
Right.
And, you know, I first experienced loyalty when I found the barber. You know what I mean? You don't go to anybody else that's not your barber.
Right. And you feel weird when you walk in and you go to somebody else.
You feel like you're cheating. It's like, this isn't right.
You kind of look at him like, I got to go, but and he's like,
Or the worst thing is, you had to go. You're somewhere out of town. You're somewhere you shouldn't be. You had to go to someone else, and then you go back to your barber, and you go, he knows. And he knows. He knows he didn't do this.
Who did that? Who cut? You're like, let's just not talk about it.
So your old man, your dad was one of these incredible people.
Yeah.
Owned a barbershop.
He owned a barbershop and pastored a small church for 4 years, but for most of his life, had this barbershop on Auburn Avenue that his brother passed down to him, who cut Dr. King's dad's hair.
Oh, wow.
And so Dr. King's dad would drive my uncle home a lot of times. And this was like so they actually had a pretty close relationship, which I didn't find out until a couple of years ago. And so now, with me kind of being in relationship with Dr. King's daughter, it's just this weird connection. And I talked to her about it. We were all like, what's going on? I don't even know how we got connected. But when you ask the question of, you know, how did his legacy in the city of Atlanta impact me? I mean, you can't do anything in Atlanta without thinking about Dr. King.
Wow.
Because it's murals everywhere. There are remnants of him in that city. But I think the biggest thing that it did for me was, one, teach me that no matter what the obstacles are, I can still overcome.
Right.
If I fight, if I push, if I persevere. Because when, you know, growing up black, right, in America and on the streets of Auburn, you see these freedom fighters that never made excuses for the conditions of the country, but won anyway and fought anyway. So that's one. I think the other thing that it really taught me was an honest and true strategy that really works when you start talking about cultural revolution. And for me, I mean, I just didn't know anything about it. And most people are not familiar with Kingian nonviolence, the 6 steps to Kingian nonviolence and the 6 principles of Kingian nonviolence. One of the reasons that Coretta Scott King started the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Change was to get Dr. King's philosophy and methodology into the next generation, because it was so powerful. And it's one of the things that when I look around our world today, I think I see so many of us trying to create a solution. I get that question all the time. Well, what's the solution? What's the solution? I think we're really good at naming the problem. We know what the problems are, right? Let's just be honest. We know what they are. They may be controversial to say on social media. You may end up in a fight over it. But if we were to just be honest, we know what the issues are in America. We have a history of slavery, so on and so forth. But I'm not sure many of us know how to really solve it and what is actually a way forward. And so understanding what Dr. King taught and the principles that he followed really has helped me in this season have hope that, wait a minute, there is an actual way forward that if I follow it, rooted in Christ, we can see change. So
I love that. I remember recently having a conversation with someone on our staff, Elizabeth, who's here as well. we were talking as we were discussing and looking at things for this week and for our church to really place value and honor on Dr. King's life. We were even just talking about photo selection.
Yeah.
And we talked about how we wanted to make sure that the photo that we used was a photo of color, like in color. Right. Because so much of them are they are black and white.
Right.
But she brought up a really great point, which I want to ask you about as well, is going, one of the reasons why we wanted to do that is that when it's in a black and white photo, the person feels so distant. Yeah. It feels almost like unattainable. Dr. King's life is so amazing and exemplary that he almost seems so far away at times. And one of the small things we wanted to do is to bring pictures that were in color to show the life of who he was. Do you feel like in some ways, when we look at his life and maybe society as a whole, have we just made him this figure that is so far away? Yeah. And kind of to your point of what you're talking about, the things that a lot of people might not know those steps of what he actually wanted to put into place of nonviolence. Do you think that he's become, in some ways, this figure that people kind of, they respect, but he's over here.
Yeah.
He's over here. Yeah, you know, and we honor that and all. That's all good. But now we're gonna, you know, we'll bring him up once a year.
Yeah, man. It's interesting. There was the day I woke up and I realized that not many people still agree with him.
Wow.
And it was a very difficult day for me. It actually was in the middle of a lot of the civil unrest that we found over this past summer, or at least the last summer, with some of the riots, but a lot of the peaceful protests as well. I just woke up one day and I realized, by talking to a lot of friends and looking at the media and seeing all this, that I don't think people agree with his strategy. And what was interesting is, and this is back to your point, because I do think people see him as, oh, that worked back then, right? Like that's him. There's a mural. It's not going to work now, so on and so forth. But it's interesting because in his day, there's an actual clip where he's screaming at the top of his lungs that no matter how many people disagree with love as a way forward, he's never going to change. And he's screaming, and it cuts to this interview in which the interviewer is asking him, "Hey, there are a lot of black leaders that do not agree with your way forward. Like, they call you Uncle Tom, they call you this, they call you weak, they call you all these things. And how do you respond to it?" And so and he was saying, you know, one, I don't care what anybody thinks about my way forward. I think it's the way forward, and we saw it work. Right. Because we're living in the result of it. And love, I'm not talking about love in a passive way. I'm not talking about weak love. I'm talking about a love that is rooted in fortitude, unfiltered truth, peaceful protest, all these other love in action. Right. But it was interesting to think about that this past summer, because I said there were people that disagreed with him then. And there are so many people, I think even more now, that if we really were to start to get into what it actually takes to change this world, would disagree. Yeah, right. Today. So yes, I do think people see him over there. That's to your point.
I mean, it's hard, right? It's hard. You know, those that forget the past are doomed to repeat it, right? And I think oftentimes that tends to be, unfortunately, the human cycle. Is we tend to just repeat and we repeat and we repeat. And, you know, looking again from his examples, being a pastor, there's often a lot of, and this might be a bit of a controversial kind of question here.
Today's the day, right?
Today's the day, right? You know, why not? Because, you know, given everything that's happening currently, you know, there's a lot of people that, like you just mentioned, will say that's not the right way to do it. There are people that say the church shouldn't be involved in politics. Keep politics out of church. You know, and they'll bring in separation of church and state. Other people go, just preach the gospel. The gospel is enough. We don't need to make comments about these things, because in and of itself the gospel will address these things. But how do we manage that tension? We look at, you know, Dr. King's life as a pastor who felt that call to get involved, felt that call to do something about it. It was his faith that really drove him to find this equality amongst all people in our country. You know, how do we do that now? You know, you stepping into this role as our lead pastor in Atlanta, and you know, myself even recently in California. It's going.
Which I'm extremely excited about.
I'm excited too, you know.
I'm talking about you.
I'm so excited for you. But I'm just saying, like, is that wrong? Is that wrong now? Is that one of those things that it worked back then, it doesn't work now?
Whew, what a question. I'm almost exploding as I'm thinking about that question.
Because I think
such a big question.
Because I think that's the biggest. That's what it really comes down to.
Yeah.
Is we've got people that are frustrated at the church. We'll say the church at large, going, where are you?
Yeah.
Why aren't you leading this?
Yeah.
You look at Dr. King's life. The church led it then. Where's the church now? Yeah. And then we've got maybe a same people within our very own churches as well, looking at the church and going, why are we going off topic here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, we've got a mission.
Yeah.
And this is what we've got to do.
I had a moment, bro, like 2 weeks ago, when I thought about making a post on social media that said, all right, I'm done fighting for social justice online. I'm not talking about it anymore.
Right.
And it's because I can't win with any of you. Like I was just gonna retire. I was like,
I'm done.
Right, I'm done because, and to your point, one of the reasons, and I'm gonna backfill this.
Easy.
One of the reasons why I think it's so difficult for us to answer the question as leaders and as pastors to kind of lead out and kind of give a solution is because we have people in our churches that are so polarized. They're on completely different sides, and you're trying to build an environment in which the church becomes the hope of the community.
Right.
But what do you do when you have a community as a leader that is split?
Right.
On both sides, and you don't want to just make a church for Democrats.
Right.
You don't just want to make a church for Republicans. You want to make a church for all people.
That's
but at
right.
the same time, you want to speak truth in love. And so I think the tension is speaking truth and not winning with anyone. And so you feel, and I'm just going to be really honest, you feel as a leader that you just should get out of the conversation.
Right.
But then you feel love compelling you to get into the conversation.
Right.
And I think what it communicates is what Dr. King always talked about, is that we're living in two Americas. That, and he would characterize it as the Black America and the white America. I would probably characterize it now as the liberal America and the more conservative America. Because I think that now, as the country browns, right, and becomes a little bit more multicultural, we have different cultures and all types of cultures on different sides.
Yeah, that's right.
And especially in a church like Hillsong, that has all cultures coming in LA, especially when I walked in, I said, this is amazing. Yeah. Right? They've got a Hispanic, elite. Yeah. And so we're living in these two worlds. And I think one of the things that's really keeping us apart is that we don't understand each other's world because they're just so, far apart. And here's another thing I want to say. One of the reasons, and this is gonna sound like a black and a white thing. It is that, but it also isn't. Okay. And I think this is something that people have to understand, especially when they say politics or social justice doesn't belong on Sunday morning, right? It's preach the gospel. One of the things that I think we have to understand is that the reason that Dr. King got involved in politics was because the Black community was being discriminated against through politics. So law. In other words, let's go back. Montgomery bus boycott, right? Lunch counter sit-ins, the right to vote. In other words, there was a time when we could not ride on the bus in the same way with white people. It just was what it was. Right. It was very clear. We could not eat in the same restaurants with white people. Yeah. We could not vote, right. So on and so forth. And so I think what people have to understand even about the Black church, because that's really where he came out of the Black church and was leading a predominantly African-American church. The Black church was the foundation and really the center of the Black community. Wow. In other words, we didn't have power anywhere else but in the church. Wow. We didn't have leadership anywhere else but in the church. When you look at corporate America, you just go back to the 60s and go, okay, we couldn't even vote, we couldn't eat, we couldn't do this. No, we weren't massive business owners that were operating at the highest level. We weren't in government like that. So we did not have any power. So our leaders were raised up in the church. Wow. So in other words, The pastor became the politician. He became the preacher. He was also a counselor. He was an activist. He had to be all in one because that's the only place that we could control.
Wow.
And so with that being said, he had to talk about that. And it was through the church, and I want everybody to hear this, that laws were changed. So what does that mean? That means that on the other side of the tracks, your more Caucasian-led ministries, like they weren't experiencing oppression from a legal perspective or through a political lens. So they had the privilege or the liberty to not have to talk about politics on a Sunday morning.
Right.
Because they didn't need the church. They were in power already to be able to change that. And so I think that's a little bit of the tension today of going, okay, where should the church step in and where shouldn't it step in? And one more thing and I'm done. I think the greatest threat to our democracy, and this is where the church comes in, is misinformation. In other words, let me say it a different way, confusion.
Right.
I think, and you know this because we live on all different sides. I've got friends that are Republicans. I got friends that's Democrats. I got friends that's independent. I'm personally politically homeless.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't know where to go.
Right? I'm with you.
I'm just gonna be honest. I feel like the left is going too left. I feel like the right is going too right. I am advocating for a third party.
But I also feel like the more you pastor people, the more you're leading, the more you go, I can see where you're coming from.
Yes.
I hear you. There are conversations that I have where people are sharing their experiences and I go, man, I grew up, my parents illegally immigrated to America. So even our experiences were a little different from the Black community.
Right.
And then even then there was in my neighborhood hostilities between the Black community and the Hispanic community, and it was its own kind of tension there, and so there are people that I'll speak to in our church and that have had these crazy experiences that you can't overlook, you can't just shrug your shoulders at, and then I've also had amazing conversations with other people in our church where I go, well, you know what? I hear you 100% as well. And it is, I think, still that responsibility to stand in the gap.
Yeah.
And I believe is our role to teach our people within our church how to have conversation.
And the reason that that's so important, I'm so glad you said it, I'm about to explode again, is because, the text talks about the truth setting us free. And I go back to this idea, and I've been thinking a lot about this lately because I'm like, how is it that when something happens, we can't collectively as America condemn certain things together and agree on it? I'm like, what is going on? Like people, these are believers that are disagreeing. And one of the things that I found is that I think what the enemy wants to do and what he's doing is keeping the truth from all of us. In other words, we're all seeing in part, and we're making decisions based on what we see. And a lot of our perspectives are very limited.
Right.
And I believe that if all of us were able to see clearly the other side, we could see the truth and then collectively build a solution and condemn certain things that need to be condemned in love, very hard, and take the world to a better place. And I go back to when we talk about Dr. King. Most people don't know this. In his 6 steps of Kingian nonviolence, the number one step is information gathering. People have never heard that. In other words, he would say, before you try to solve an issue in culture or a social ill, you need to know all sides of it.
Wow.
He said you should be able to state your opponent's opinion better than them. You should know everything about what they're saying. And so I always ask the question, if you're a Democrat, do you know fully the Republican perspective? Like, have you gone to the other side and go, all right, I have my opinion, but explain it to me.
Yeah.
And I'm going to restate it back to you. Yeah. And then vice versa, Republican, do you know the Democrat? White, do you know the Black? black? Do you know the white? And here's what we'll find, because I've done it so many times. We will find that if we go to the other side and actually start asking questions and understanding, there's something we missed.
Right.
On both sides.
Yeah.
And then the truth is able to be seen, and we're able to go, okay, and then we can collectively come together and go, okay, we need to get rid of that.
Right.
Go ahead.
And I actually think that one of the biggest lies that we've come to believe is that healthy relationships are ones without argument. That healthy relationships are one without discussion, debate. I personally believe, and I hope that as for us in California, I want us to be a church that have different views from each other, and that we learn to have those conversations, because like we talked about, we don't want just the church to look exactly the same. But you see that in marriage, it's going like, good tension is a good thing as well. Having good conversation, talking these things out, it actually helps bring the better of both people in that. And I hope that in our church, it's one of the things that I love about Pastors Brian and Bobby.
Yeah.
They have faithfully served and built a church that is incredibly diverse, all across, not just Australia, but all around the world, and now have obviously entrusted us to do the same and keep doing that as well. And I think one of the things I'm committed to, and I guess I just want to even ask you is, I'm committed to having these conversations with people that might be uncomfortable, it might not always be the resolve that I want. But it's a good place for truth to be known as we're talking here. But I guess I wanted to ask you, as we look to the future, you stepping into lead pastor of Hillsong Atlanta, how does this, if at all, shape what your heart is for the city of Atlanta, for the church moving forward? We've talked about obviously the tensions already of what Dr. King went through and the things that are important now. I love what you said about, everything was found in the church as well. But even as you kind of ponder and look into the future and what's ahead, what's stirring inside, Sam and Tony for Atlanta,
As soon as we walked into Hillsong LA, I told you this. You were preaching, it was a Christmas service. This is before you were lead.
Christmas, yeah. Yeah, that's
right. You were campus pastor.
That's right.
And we knew that day that Hillsong was our home.
Wow.
And we had no idea how any of this was going to happen, but we knew that God was speaking to us. Never thought we would be lead pastors here. Thought maybe we might be in the family. But we stepped in there, and I remember texting Darren Kiddo. And after that service, you preached it. You were sitting in your chair.
I remember.
And you were jumping up. You were doing what you do. And I texted him and I said, however long we need to wait, we'll wait. This is what we believe God is doing, and we have no idea how this is going to work. But we felt like this church would be an amazing foundation for the city of Atlanta to create a multicultural space. And when you're in the South, the roots of the South are very deep. When you look at the churches that we have, it's a very it's a polarizing environment. It's usually predominantly white churches or predominantly black churches. Right. It's very separate. It's very easy to see the history of slavery and the result of discrimination and all these other things in real time and how it's played out over the years. And there are some cultural churches here and there, but for the most part, they're not really any massive multicultural movements or churches in the South. So a dream for us is to be able to create a space where we can bring both worlds together.
Come on.
And you spoke about the idea of marriage and how tough conversations and debate can bring about revelation that creates change. And that is our dream, that we would create an environment not absent of truth. Because a lot of people will hear the idea of love and of what we're talking about, and they look at us and they go, y'all are soft, right? You need to be that. But that's not what we're saying.
No.
We're saying, let's get to the table. Many people, and this goes back to the education piece around understanding King's philosophy, he would protest when he could not sit down with people. protest, he would use the language, it was direct action when you could not sit down and negotiate.
Right.
And I think in this generation and in this day and age, we want to get straight to the action,
right.
but not understanding that, no, the goal is not to have to protest every day.
Right.
The goal is to protest so you can sit down. But if you can sit down, there's no need to protest.
That's great.
So that you can collectively work together. And so our goal is to have these tough conversations, truth telling.
Right.
We want to talk about the history of America. We want to talk about the Republican Party. We want to talk about the Democratic Party. We want to talk about the government. We want to talk about racism. Right. We want to talk about all of these things, but we also want to be honoring in every perspective,
right.
so that we can fully understand each other and see where the gaps are. And here's what I believe, this is our dream, that on both sides we'll see what we were missing, so that we can collectively become unified and collectively create a solution that will lead to lasting change and justice for all. So,
what do you think the next step is from here? I mean,
get off.
I mean, because look,
yeah,
I hear you, and I'm guessing there might be people watching that they're going, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying about a seat at the table for us to have these conversations, but it feels like, or I don't know, maybe I might be speaking for somebody here.
Yeah.
But feels like I've sat at the table so many times.
Yeah.
And I'm promised the conversation of change. But how many times can I come to the table and bring up the same issue?
Yeah.
Do you think that there's still a place at the table?
I love that question. I think my short answer is, I think we need to come to the table as much as possible. I don't think it's about giving up on the table. I think it's about forcing the table consistently. The thing I loved about this summer was that I loved the peaceful protest. I loved seeing celebrities, seeing some pastors, seeing athletes all marching peacefully together, essentially screaming and demanding that we sit down and actually create change. In other words, and goes back to what we say about the philosophy. In other words, we tried to have the conversation, and it's to your point, and nothing happened. Okay, now we need to go to direct action. I'm not talking about violence, because Christianity is rooted in the idea of nonviolence. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, hey, okay, nothing happened. Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now? Okay, you hear me? And we saw what happened. I haven't seen as much change happen as fast as it did than this past summer. There were organizations hiring people of color like never before, putting policies in place like never before, changing things like never before. But what I loved about it, and this is something that even the NBA had to deal with when they were dealing with protests and all these other things. One of the things that LeBron was consistently asking was, well, what's our plan? Like, okay, we got the attention, right, but now we got to sit back down again and say, hey, here's the plan and here's how we want to create change. So I think the next step is perseverance. And I think it's the people of goodwill that believe in love and action, right, becoming louder about love and action. Because I think for many of us, we have let the radical right and left lead the conversation. Right. As opposed to the ones that actually believe in love and action and true change, standing up for what they believe is right and modeling sitting down at the table. In other words, I think this is the future. Yeah. What we're doing right now and putting it out and just being raw and vulnerable about here's what we think.
Well, I got two more questions for you.
Yeah.
As we kind of wrap up, but when we talk about change, it can sometimes be this ambiguous goal. Yeah. Right? We all want change. We all want But what are we talking about specifically?
Yeah.
Because one of the dangers that I see, I'm going to be honest and transparent.
Please.
And
This is the point.
This is one of the dangers I see. One of the dangers I see is external. There are things that are obviously in our language unacceptable, right? Name calling, whatever that might be that we go, that's not okay. But then where is the line between us wanting to place external changes on someone to try to cure a biased or a racist heart? Basically what I'm trying to say is the changes that we're looking for, how much of that is just an external Band-Aid to cover something that is actually internal? What's the change that we want to see? Is the change that we want to see to end racism forever? Because the chances are, while we're still on this earth, as we will probably know, that's probably not going to happen.
Right.
But I still see, and I believe that there are some people that have taken on that fight to go, we are going to end racism forever, which I feel bad because I think it's a lost cause.
Sure, as long as sin is around.
Absolutely. In general, we talk about change, it's so broad.
Yeah.
And part of that is because it feels so overwhelming.
Yeah.
When we're talking about change here,
Yeah.
what are we talking about?
Wow. I mean, I think we're talking about a lot.
Yeah.
I think if I were to...
Because I think that's
Yeah.
what keeps people on the sidelines too.
100%.
What do you want me to do? What do you want me to post about it? Which tends to be the easiest form of advocacy is social media advocacy, right? And so it's going, well, I don't know what to do. Do you want legal change? Do you want laws change? Do we want social change? Do we want again, is this a end racism forever? So don't say it like that. Don't say this. Change this. Don't talk about it that way. And it's going like, okay, for some people it goes, man, you're just putting rules on me, And so it's going, what's the change we're looking for here?
Yeah, I mean, I know I keep going back to Dr. King. It is MLK Day.
It is. It is. There's nothing wrong with that.
One of the things that I'm going just learning and educating us all, even myself as a reminder, when you look at, because this was the same question that he had. If you ever go back and watch some of the MLK movies that they created, Selma, or there's another one before it with Terrence Howard. I mean, it's just amazing. It will take you into some of the war room sessions that he would have with his team. And in that session, he literally would say what you said. What are we trying to do? I mean, it was like, are we trying to get this? Because they were going to have meetings with the president at the time.
Right.
And so he was like, I have to go and ask this administration for something, and I can't ask them for 20 things. We need to figure out what we're trying to do right now, solve that, and then figure out something else, solve that, figure out. And so they would wrestle together with, there's so many things that we could change. And I think, back to your point, people are like, I mean, we need to change education. We need to change policy. We need to change the corporate sector. I mean, we need to change the church. I mean, there's so many different things that need to be changed because of the history of this country. We're kind of playing catch up to 400 years of oppression and all these other things. But when he would sit down, he would say to his team, we need to pick one thing. Because if we can pick one thing, we can solve that one thing. And then after we solve that one thing, pick another thing. And so what you saw is their first thing was, we're just going to desegregate the buses. That's it. We're not talking about voting right now. We're not talking about lunch. We're not talking about business.
Which most people would have been outraged.
Right.
By the way. It's going, man, I want to vote.
I want to do this. He said, I got you. Because here's what he realized. And this is a little bit of, I think, the era from this summer, is that I think we tried to change. And I'm not about pausing for change or not, but I think we tried to bite off too many things at once that we ended up not getting enough done because we were all into so many different directions. Like, I got to do this, I got to do that. But what we need is a collective strategy around a specific issue, and you knock that out, and then you move to the next. And so buses, businesses, and then voting.
Well, part of that was because there was that person in place, right? Dr. King was, in so many ways, there were many, many other civil rights leaders as well, right? We'd never want to downplay anybody else, but obviously he would be a prominent figure that would have been a leader in that time.
Yeah.
You know, and even as you mentioned about LeBron, what are we doing?
Right.
And that was one of the things is going, who's leading this thing?
Who's leading this thing? Yeah.
And I guess that goes to kind of conclude this conversation here, but it's going, who should lead this thing?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. King always had a phrase, he had a message called the drum major instinct. The idea was that most of us want to be drum majors, we don't want to be in the band. And I think we're living in a generation where everybody wants to be in charge, right? And nobody wants to follow anybody. It's just like, I kind of want to do that, but I also want to do this. I think in this day and age, I think we have to figure out what we're going to change and what change we're going to be a part of personally.
Yeah.
And go and solve that. For some of us, it's going to be, man, there's a history of oppression for women or for minorities in the church. That's your thing. Let that be your thing, solve that. And once you get that to a place that you're happy with, move to the next one. For some people, it's going to be in the corporate arena. For some people, it's going to be in the political sphere. We need everybody everywhere.
It's great.
But I think for each of us individually, when we talk about what do I do next, I think you got to do something, but you have to get focused and pick your thing and go and solve it. Last story and I'm done. Being friends with Dr. Bernice King for a while, she told me, she said, Sam, you know, we were at the King Center in an office one day, and she said, Sam, you got to figure out what you want to change. She was like, my mother told me early on, before she passed, that Bernice, there's always going to be problems. And if you try to solve all of them at once, you're going to kill yourself. She said, but you got to figure out what you want to do and let somebody else deal with the rest. But you figure out what your thing is and you lock in on it and you move. And I think that's my encouragement to everybody right now.
That's great, man.
Is to lock in on something.
It's good.
Don't just stand on the sidelines. Fight from where you stand.
And that's tough because social media, you feel the pressure to care about everything. Yeah. Gotta care about this going on here, pray for this part, pray for this. And I want to, but it's God never designed us to carry the burden of the world.
Right.
He called us to change our world and where we are.
Preach.
And
Preach.
I remember hearing a preacher tell a story about how he was telling some type of anecdote about a pastor who moves into a church and the church was close to a trailer park.
Yeah.
And one person in the church came in and she goes, you know why those people don't come into our church? They don't care about them because we don't help the poor and they're poor. And so we need to do things in the community. And he goes, okay. And he wrote it down and thank you. And the next day someone else comes in and he goes, you know why those people don't come to our church? And it's because, there's so many broken families there. We need to do things that are specifically for families and that ministry of making sure that there are healthy families and great youth ministries. And he walks out and a third person comes in and it goes, you know why those people don't come to our church? They don't come to our church because, our church isn't fun. We make it too strict. It's this and that. And we need to make sure that we have an inclusive nature about our church. And the pastor goes on to say, who was right? Is it the person that thought that we need to do stuff for families? Was it the inclusive nature? Or was it the people to do something in the outreach for low-income families? Which one was right?
Right.
And he goes on to say, they're all right.
Yeah.
They're all right. And oftentimes, the reason why we see the things that we see is because we're actually called to fix the problem that we see. And you never know. It's like, I think sometimes we get overwhelmed by the problems that we see, but I actually think it's sometimes a God-given insight that if there's a problem, maybe I'm called to be the solution to fix it.
100%.
So, do you mind just praying for us to wrap this conversation up, man? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For being with us.
We got to do more.
I'm in.
Yeah. God, we thank you so much for who you are. We know that Jesus prayed that above all we would be one. That in the kingdom there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor male nor female, nor black nor white. There's kingdom citizens. God, as we pray for our oneness, would you give us all the fortitude, and would you bother us until we get focused on the thing that you have called for us to solve? We know that this country is not perfect. As we echo a friend of mine earlier, some may believe that this country is on fire. There's a lot going on. The question that I think we all are asking is, where's the church? And the church is us. And I pray that as the church, we would take our place in culture and model the type of unity, the type of truth telling, the type of sacrifice that you modeled for us. Let us take our place and let this world be different because of the principles and because of the sacrifice of Christ. Let us not grow weary in well-doing, but that if we keep going, if we faint not, the harvest will be reaped, and that the universe is on the side of justice, which means that your kingdom will ultimately win in the end. Let us take our place and let us do our part. In Jesus' name, amen.